On January 17, 1893, the last reigning sovereign of Hawaii abdicated in protest to a group of American businessmen who had staged a coup with the help of the U.S. government. So, what happened? How did Hawaii go from being a monarchy to a U.S. territory to the 50th state? Welcome back to the channel. This is Inspecting History, and I'm Julian Gower. Now today I wanted to talk about the monarchy of Hawaii, its overthrow, and the U.S. involvement. The last sovereign was Queen Liliuokalani, and to understand how she was forced to abdicate, we have to go back to the reign of her brother, King Kalakaua. He was elected king in 1874. Yes, I said elected king. The Hawaiian Constitution states that a monarch has to name his heir and sovereign before he passes, and if he doesn't, then the government gets to elect a king. King Kalakaua was considered the merry monarch. He brought back a lot of the native customs that had been lost in the prior reigns, including the hula. He and his sister, the future queen, were gifted musicians, and they wrote many compositions. And his sister actually wrote the quintessential Hawaiian song, Aloha O. By this time, sugar plantations were on all of the islands, and they were mostly owned by white Americans who were the grandchildren of the missionaries. In 1876, the king negotiated a treaty with the U.S. to export sugar, tax-free, in exchange for the use of Pearl Harbor. But what the U.S. really wanted was exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor, and when the treaty was up in 1886, the United States government started to renegotiate. Well, the king said no, because he saw that the benefits of this sugar trade weren't benefiting the native Hawaiians, but the American plantation owners. The business community, aka the white American plantation owners, were in an uproar. Loren Thurston, the Hawaiian Minister of the Interior, started a secret society with all of these white American plantation owners, and they called themselves the Hawaiian Patriotic League. And it was a 13-member group, and they had joined forces with the Citizens Militia of the Honolulu Rifles. Now, that was a citizens militia made up again of all white Americans. They saw only one way out of this mess, and that was to become annexed by the United States. And that meant overthrowing the monarchy. In July of 1887, they drafted a new constitution which limited the king's power and gave more power to his cabinet, which was voted in. Now, they also made changes to the voting rights. It now allowed foreign resident aliens, aka them, to vote. And it also forbade native Hawaiians from voting unless they were landowners. In order to vote, you now had to own property valued at least $3,000 or have an annual income of no less than $600. So basically what they've done here is they've written this constitution so they could vote themselves into power, which they did. They made their way to the palace and they forced the king at gunpoint to sign the new constitution, and he called it the Bayonet Constitution. The conspirators were not pleased that the king signed so quickly. They really wanted him to hesitate. They wanted a reason to overthrow or possibly even assassinate him. After that, the king had no choice but to sign the treaty with the United States. The sugar trade rebounded and everybody went back to normal until 1890, when the king went to California for a trip and in January of 1891 died. The king's sister, Liliuokalani, became the Queen of Hawaii and immediately started working on a new constitution that would give her power back and restore the voting rights to the native Hawaiians. But two of her ministers were in the society, and they let the others know. So they regrouped and they formed the Community of Safety. Their purpose was to act if the Queen indeed tried to institute this new constitution, which she did on January 14th, 1893, and her cabinet did not back her. This was all that the community of safety needed to act. They had the backing of the U.S. government minister John L. Stevens and Captain G.C. Wiltz of the USS Boston that was anchored in Honolulu Harbor. On January 16th, the Marshal of the Kingdom, Charles Burnett Wilson, discovered the planned coup, and he requested warrants to arrest the 13-member council of the Committee of Safety. That request had gone to Minister John L. Stevens, and he repeatedly denied them. What Wilson was able to do was to gather a very small army to protect the Queen. Later that day, the Committee of Safety issued their proclamation declaring martial law, deposing the Queen, and establishing the provisional government. 162 U.S. Marines were positioned right outside of the palace. Now that put the Queen in a very precarious situation. She didn't have the backing of her cabinet, she was outnumbered, and she knew she could not take on the U.S. government. So the Queen was forced to yield authority on January 17, 1893. I, Liliuokalani, by the grace of God and under the Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established a provisional government of and for this kingdom. That I yield to the superior force of the United States of America, whose minister, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the provisional government. Now, to avoid any collusion of armed forces and perhaps the loss of life, I do this under protest and impelled by said force yield my authority until sometime as the government of the United States shall, upon facts being presented to it, undo the action of its representatives and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands. U.S. President Cleveland requested an investigation, and it found that the coup was illegal and that the Queen should be returned to power. He turned the matter over to the Senate, but they chose not to act and not to annex. So the Republic of Hawaii was created on July 2nd, 1894, when their new constitution was ratified, and they named Judge Sanford Dole as the president. On January 6, 1859, several hundred Native Hawaiians and other royalists mounted a counter-revolution to restore the monarchy. Well, they were discovered, arrested, and imprisoned. And on January 16, 1895, Liliuokalani was arrested, and she was taken to her former palace and imprisoned in an upstairs room, where on January 24th, she was forced to sign a document of abdication. She later stated, "For myself, I would have chosen death rather than to have signed it. But it was represented to me that by signing this paper, all the persons who had been arrested, all my people now in trouble by reason of their love and loyalty towards me, would be immediately released." She was tried and found guilty and sentenced to 5 years hard labor and a $5,000 fine. Now, none of those sentences were carried out. Instead, she was imprisoned at the palace in an upstairs bedroom, and that imprisonment lasted 8 months. She spent the rest of her life fighting for the Hawaiian people, and she traveled to Washington to lobby against annexation many, many times, and she died in 1917. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out, and the United States realized how important Hawaii was, and it was formally annexed on August 12, 1898. Hawaii became a territory in 1900, and it became the 50th state in 1959. In 1993, the U.S. government issued a formal apology. The United States government acknowledges that the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii occurred with the active participation of agents and citizens of the United States, and further acknowledges that the native Hawaiian people never directly relinquished to the United States their claims to their inherited sovereignty as a people over their national lands, either through the Kingdom of Hawaii or through referendum. The referendum really didn't do anything. It didn't change the statehood of Hawaii. It was just an apology. And interesting enough, it came 100 years after the overthrow. And that is how the U.S. government helped overthrow the monarchy of Hawaii. I hope you liked this story. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more Inspecting History. New episodes every Thursday.